All right, so first, thanks for the C3 for running this year and letting us all kind of talk about our experiences. I think it's been great to hear other people say the same things and kind of take away what others have done. So in my particular talk, I'm going to take a look at exams and kind of just how I thought about exams coming into this fully remote year that we've just come out of, or for my case, I'm still teaching, so I'm still stuck in it. But so in this case, one of the first things, when we learned about fall 2020 being remote learning still, it seemed like a really daunting task to prepare all of these courses for the remote learning environment, especially for myself as a teaching intensive instructor. I teach at least 3 courses per term, about 7 to 8 courses per academic year. So the one saving grace on this, though, was that at least this time we had a little bit of forewarning, unlike the end of that winter 2020 term. So my initial thoughts when we got to this point were to begin to prepare these fall courses on how to best deliver the content within the remote environment. What methods would support my students as they were forced to alter their own concepts of how they learn in this remote environment. So of course, you wrestle with things like, asynchronous versus synchronous delivery, all of these emerging online technologies that are all of a sudden at our fingertips. And of course, the great debate of what the heck do we do with all of our laboratories in this remote environment. But once we have these remote courses kind of structured in answering all of these questions, we really had to take a look at how to align the formal assessments with the new design of the remote course. So in this case, when we found ourselves going into this, thinking about what kinds of assessment would be suited to the remote environment, it was mostly looking at, like Erica has mentioned just now, what challenges the students were going to be faced with. So the most common form of summative assignment within undergraduate chemistry courses is that traditional timed exam. However, in this case, I wasn't really sure that that was going to work for my remote environment courses. So you have students becoming heavily reliant on their computers, their internet connection to complete the coursework and their assessments. So the assessments then need to address the issues of poor and unreliable internet connection for many of my students. We take for granted how well we can connect to the internet, but for some students, that's not the reality. And there's a significant stress associated for students taking a timed exam in a remote environment when they are so heavily reliant on that internet connection. I was also worried about new softwares being used for these assessments, any additional cognitive load that we're going to add to them, that additional stress. Thinking to myself, ultimately, are we looking to test their understanding of the subject matter, or are we looking to test their ability to navigate the online exam platform? So that was something I thought about. And a lot of people have mentioned throughout the conference this idea of different time zones. I mean, our students were taking their courses remotely. They weren't necessarily in Peterborough, where Trent is located. We've got people all across the country and all across the world. So accommodating an exam in that regard, while possible, seemed like a lot of work in conjunction with all of these other concerns that I did have. And the last thing I had a real struggle with was, of course, we bring up the issues of academic integrity. For me, it wasn't necessarily the academic integrity itself, while important. It was the feelings of uncomfortableness around these proctoring systems that had been suggested to ensure that integrity. A lot of times they're taking over students' computers, or they're requiring cameras to be on in very personal environments. So it was just something I wasn't comfortable exposing my students to. So basically, it became an assumption that at this point, if I were to run an exam, it was going to be open book, because I couldn't monitor the way that they were using the materials that they had at hand, being at home rather than in something like a giant gymnasium writing an exam. So working with this idea of unproctored exams essentially becoming open book, I elected to do away with my exams entirely. I was the only person to do this in the department, and I moved to what I called summative assignments instead. They were initially designed to replace these summative examinations that happen, at the midway and endpoints of the course, but they were quite a lot larger than your traditional assignments would be. And the focus was no longer on the students' general knowledge of the content that was delivered, but their ability to apply that knowledge. So in completing these assignments, the students have access to their class notes. They could, within reason, collaborate with one another and therefore reap a lot of these benefits of collaborative learning. So this is just one example of a question pulled from one of my second year analytical chemistry assignments. The students were very, very briefly introduced to a series of spectroscopic techniques within the course, and the question was designed to have no single correct answer. With this, the students were applying their knowledge of spectroscopy and the techniques discussed. And the emphasis on the grading here was in their discussion of the selected technique they chose and why it was this particular technique was, in their mind, the best choice given the scenario they were presented with here. So it was an open-ended question, no particular correct answer, and we're really looking at assessing the students' knowledge and understanding and application of that material. So it's just a different type of question. And in order to gain a little bit of insight into how the students perceived the assignments, I did ask them a few anonymous survey questions. The first one being to select which method, their knowledge of traditional exams they've sat before, or the summative assignments used in my courses, which one offered them the best opportunity for actually learning and understanding the course material. And most of the students, 88% basically, indicated that the assignments allowed them a better understanding of the material rather than just the rote memorization process of studying for a midterm or final exam. And I also asked them which method offered the best opportunity to actually showcase their true understanding of the material for grading purposes. And again, the most common answer here was that the summative assignments really allowed them to show their knowledge. This was expected, as many students indicate that exam anxiety is a cause of poor performance. Of course, they have their notes accessible to them. And the idea that students always come back and say, well, I didn't study the right thing. You asked a question that I didn't study. So it's that, what ends up on a final exam is, while I'm making it, the questions I deem important. So there was actually a greater proportion, though, in this question that did say, I can, of course, show my knowledge through an exam, or that both of them allow them to show their knowledge. So from the responses to the survey, they were really responding well to these assignments. Within the surveys, they were allowed to comment on their thoughts of these summative assignments versus the traditional exam. And I generally was able to group their comments into about 3 different major themes. Sorry, I can see the chat is moving. Am I close to time? I can't see anything in this presenter mode. So I'll just go through really quickly. They mentioned a lot less stress in this environment, brought on by not having to sit, in that timed exam room. So that was a big one. We saw that they actually presented an increased knowledge, or they had their own perception of increased knowledge, retaining it much farther past the exam period than normal. And that a lot of the students found that the assignments gave them increased confidence within themselves. They saw grade boosts. They felt that the grades actually represented their knowledge, and they were much more engaged with the course in this case. So I'm thinking going forward, this worked really well. It's a little bit different than students just cramming in the knowledge for the exam and then dumping it out of their brain 2 minutes later to cram the next exam's information in. So here, going forward, using these types of summative assignments or some variation of them, I can look to students and utilize these for their learning, how much they've learned, but also with the students using them as a form of learning and engaging with the content, creating a deeper understanding. So I want to go through keeping these, getting rid of traditional exams, I think, but tweaking them a little bit, perhaps being a little bit more collaborative in nature intentionally, in addition to individual assignments, and just kind of thinking about where they can go from here beyond just simply going with the straight exam option. So I'll leave it there because I know I'm a little bit over.